can you say that there's even a movie running? Because the movie seems to be the experience of the movie, not the objective elements of the movie. And there's something about the world, at least insofar as we're in it as human beings, that is dependent on conscious experience of the world. Now, of course, you can take consciousness out of the world and say, well, if none of us were here, if there was no such thing as consciousness, then the cosmos would continue running the way it is running. But of course, it depends on what exactly you mean by the cosmos when you make a statement like that, because there's something about the subjective experience of reality that gives it reality. Or at least that's one way of looking at it. And since we're all pretty enamored of our own consciousnesses, although they're painful because they define our being, it's not unreasonable to give consciousness a kind of metaphysical primacy. Now, and it's deeper than that, you know, it's a deeper idea than that, because there are physicists, and they're not trivial physicists like John Wheeler, who believes that in some sense consciousness plays a constitutive role in transforming the chaotic potential of being into the actuality of being. And he actually thinks about it, he's not alive anymore, but he actually thought about it as playing a constitutive role, you know. And then from the neurobiological perspective, or from the scientific perspective, it's like consciousness is not something we understand. I don't think we understand it at all. It's something we can't get a handle on with our fundamental materialist philosophy. And I don't know why that is. It's quite frustrating if you're a scientist, but it isn't clear to me that we've made any progress whatsoever in understanding consciousness, even though, well, we've been trying to understand it for hundreds of years, and even though psychologists and neurobiologists and so forth have really put a lot of effort into understanding consciousness from a scientific perspective in the last 50 years. So anyways, what it seems to me is the idea that God used the word to extract habitable order out of chaos at the beginning of time, which is roughly the right way of thinking about it, seems to me deeply allied with the idea that what it is that we do as human beings is encounter something like a formless and potential chaos. I mean, we're not omniscient, obviously, and we can't just do whatever we want, but we encounter a formless and chaotic potential. That's always what we're grappling with. And somehow we use our consciousness to give that form. And this is how people act. Like if you look at how they regard themselves, it's how they act. Because you say things to people like, well, you should live up to your potential. And you make a case that there's something about a person that's more than what is, that yet could be if only they participated in the process properly. And everyone knows what that means, and no one acts like a mystery has been uttered when you say that. And you know, you can see a situation in your own life that's full of potential. You're often extremely excited when you encounter something that's full of potential, because what you see is something that could be. You see a future beckoning for you that could be if only you interacted with it properly. And it activates your nervous system, right, in a very basic way. And we even understand how that happens to the degree that we understand how the nervous system works, because the systems that mediate positive emotion, which are governed roughly by the neurochemical dopamine, and which have their roots way down in the ancient hypothalamus, a very, very archaic and fundamental part of the brain, that responds to potential, which is the possibility of accruing something new and valuable. It responds to potential with active movement forward and engagement. And so we're engaged in the world as potential, and it looks like consciousness does that. And so there's this idea that, and this is the main idea that I think is being put forth in Genesis 1. It's something like, and you see this in mythology, like from what I've been able to gather, there's always three causal elements that make up being at the bottom of world mythology. And one is the formless potential that makes up being once it's interacted with, and that's generally given a feminine nature. And I think that's because it's like the source from which all things emerge and rise. It's something like that. It's more complicated than that, but it's something like that. And then there's some kind of interpretive structure that has to grapple with that formless potential. And I think that's the sort of thing that was alluded to by Immanuel Kant when he was criticizing the notion that all of our information comes from sense data, which would be the pure empirical perspective, right? Because when you encounter the world, you encounter it with a cognitive structure that already has shape. And so it's already in you, this structure. And without that a priori structure, you wouldn't be able to take the formless potential and give it structure. And I think that's something, it's akin in some way to the idea of God the Father, and I'll try to develop that idea more. It's It's the notion that there's something in all of us that transcends all of us, that's deeply structural, that's part of this ancient, well, I would say evolutionary and cultural process that enables us to grapple with the formless potential and bring forth reality, roughly speaking. And then there's the final element, and that element seems to be something like consciousness itself, the consciousness that actually inheres in the individual. So it's not only that you have a structure, it's that the structure has the capacity for action in the world. And it's like, you're the spirit that gives the dead structure life. It's something like that. And as far as I can tell, the Trinitarian notion that characterizes Christianity is something like, well, formless potential, which is never given the status of a deity in Christianity. And then the notion that there's an a priori interpretive structure that's a consequence of our ancient existence as beings. It goes back as far in time as you can go, the notion of a structure. And then the idea of a consciousness that is the tool of that structure and that interacts with the world and gives it reality. And that's the Word, as far as I can tell. And so the notion is that there's a Father, and that's the structure, and there's a Son that's transcendent, that characterizes consciousness itself, and that it's the Son, the speaking of the Son, that is the active principle that turns chaos into order. And God, it's such a sophisticated idea as far as I'm concerned, because, well, there's something about it that's at least phenomenologically accurate, because you do have an interpretive structure, and you couldn't understand anything without it. Your very body is an interpretive structure, right? It's been crafted over, let's say, 3 billion years of evolution. Without that, you wouldn't be able to perceive anything, and it's taken a lot of death and struggle and tragedy to produce you, the thing that's capable of encountering this immense chaos that surrounds us, and to transform it into habitable order. And then there's the idea too, of course, that's deeply embedded in the first chapters of Genesis, which is a staggering idea, you know, and certainly not one that's likely, that human beings were made in the image of God, both male and female were made in the image of God. And that's, of course, a very difficult thing to understand, partly because the God that's referred to in those chapters has a kind of polytheistic element, although it's an element that's moving rapidly towards a unified monotheism. But it's not also obvious to me why people would come up with that concept, because I don't really think that when we think about each other, we immediately think God-like. You know, the notion that every single human being, regardless of their peculiarities and strangenesses and sins and crimes and all of that, has something divine in them that needs to be regarded with respect and that plays an integral role, at least an analogous role, in the creation of habitable order out of chaos. That's a magnificent, remarkable, crazy idea. And yet we developed it, and I do firmly believe that it sits at the base of our legal system. I think it is the cornerstone of our legal system. That's the notion that everyone is equal before God, which is, of course, that's such a strange idea. It's very difficult to understand how anybody could have ever come up with that idea, because the manifold differences between people are so obvious and so evident that you could say the natural way of viewing someone is, or human beings, is in this extremely hierarchical manner, where some people are contemptible and easily brushed off as pointless and pathological and without value whatsoever, and all the power accrues to a certain tiny, you know, aristocratic minority at the top. But if you look at the way that the idea of the individual sovereignty developed, it's clear that it unfolded over thousands and perhaps 10,000s of years before it became something firmly fixed in the imagination that each individual had something of transcendent value about them. And man, I tell you, we dispense with that idea at our serious peril. And so, and if you're going to take that idea seriously, then, which you do because you act it out, because otherwise you wouldn't be law-abiding citizens, right? You act that idea out. It's firmly shared by everyone who acts in a civilized manner. The question is, why in the world do you believe it, assuming that you believe what you act out, which I think is a really good way of fundamentally defining belief. So, all right, so that's the sort of idea, is that there's this God of tradition and structure. That's God the Father, who uses the Son, which is more of an active force, and primarily something that's verbal, which I also think is extremely interesting because it's associated not with thought precisely, but with speech. And I think the reason for that is that there's something to speech that's more than mere thought. And I think part of the reason for that is that speech is a public utterance. And at least in principle, speech is something that's shaped by the existence of everyone else, at least across time. Because when you speak, your speech is put forward in the world as a causal element, and it's also subject to criticism and cooperation and mutual shaping. And so there's an idea here too that speech is that the cognitive processes that bring habitable reality out of uninhabitable chaos have this collective and public element, which is part of the reason, by the way, that I'm an advocate of free speech, let's say, above all, because I don't think, although it is the case, for example, in the Canadian Bill of Rights, that every single right has equal value. That's the theory. It's an idiotic theory because it's absolutely impossible for a large set of rights to have absolutely equal stances. That cannot happen. There's no way that can ever work. But that is the legal judgment. But I think it's a huge mistake because free speech has this, well, this divine quality, let's say, that you can't escape from because it's the thing that manufactures everything else.